Welcome to X-Rays Podcast. I'm your host, Shabazz X. My Facebook handle is Jihad Shakur. We back with another episode, and tonight's episode will be a good one. It's going to be short and quick. I promise not to keep you too long. It's actually going to be a part two to the story we did on the tribe of Shabazz. That was the last episode. If you haven't watched it, I suggest you go back and listen to it just to get a little background on Shabazz. But tonight's episode, we're going to look into Shabazz history, and we talked about his pros and cons last week, right? Last week. So today we will do somewhat of the same, but we're going to show how Shabazz was somewhat of a rebel. He was somewhat of a rebel to the way of God, and that word or topic is somewhat of a sore spot for some, I may say, a sore spot. But we're going to explain it and go into his rebellious nature and how that applies to us today, real briefly. But before we get started, let me say a quick prayer. In the name of Allah, who appeared in the person of Master Muhammad, to whom praises forever due, could never thank him enough for raising amongst us a divine messenger, the world know as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And in his absence, we can never thank him enough for leaving for us a divine reminder, a divine guide in this time of trouble, who the world will come to see as the Messiah. In these three names, I greet you in the words of peace and paradise in the Arabic language of Assalamu Alaikum. Right. We just gonna go down the line, and first I like to say, hit that like button, a thumbs up, and subscribe. Hit that bell and subscribe. You'll see a little icon and towards the bottom, the middle towards the bottom, it'll be a bell. You hit that bell and you'll subscribe to the channel. That way, anytime I do a video, it'll come across your screen automatically, right? So hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and share, right? So first off, we're going to do a little comparison, right? A comparative study of Shabazz and also Yaqub. And we're going to show their similarities, because they have a few detailed similarities that you may find interesting, right? So some of you probably wondering, who is Yakub? Well, briefly, Yakub was a scientist, right? A very, very wise, intelligent, who lived around 6,000 years ago, roughly. 6,000 years ago. And he was a scientist that looked into the genes of the black man. You know, that's unisex, of course. When I say black man, that means black man and woman. But he looks into our genes, and he discovered that it was two genes, two germs. Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad referred to it as a germ. He says we had a black germ and a brown germ. So Yakub discovered that from these two germs, that if he was to take the brown germ and isolate it, that he could bring it out of us and give it his own form. And this is actually how different races began on Earth. Like, why we have a color spectrum from black to brown to yellow to white, you know, everything in between, as far as the mixture of these four shades of people. So Yakub was a scientist, like I said. He was very wise, and he discovered it. So in the history or the teachings of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Yakub is the making of the devil. Yes, that's how evil spread across the planet, from the making of the devil, and from Yakub tampering with the germs or genes of the black man and woman. So here's a little background of Yakub, in terms of what he did. That was an experiment. That was an experiment, actually, of what he did. And this is really, it's short, but it's packed with deep wisdom. And I'm just gonna touch on this couple of sentences real quick, and then we'll go right into Shabazz. But in this book called The God Tribe of Shabazz, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad writes, he says, "The God that made the white man made him for the purpose of showing forth a wisdom that was yet hidden in the God that was not made manifest. This was the main purpose. It was not a useless thing for which the race was made, and it wasn't the God that created the heavens and earth, in truth that made Satan. It was a rebel of that God that made this race of people." I just want to put great emphasis on that last sentence, because that last sentence goes into the rebellion of Shabazz. All right. It says, it was a rebel of that God that made this race of people. So he's talking about Yakub. So here clearly the messenger calls Yakub a rebel, right? But in this, though, as you may be thinking, who is this Yakub? He must be some type of mad scientist, evil scientist. But here the messenger is saying that it wasn't a useless thing in terms of him making a race of evil people. He's saying that, he did it for a wise purpose, to show something that was hidden in our nature and our character that was hidden. And Yakub wanted to bring it out. It's kind of like saying, like, to expose your flaws. Like, if you never know that you have a flaw, you may continue to harbor this flaw rather, until a circumstance comes up and shows you, like, oh, you know what, I need to work on that. And then you work on it. Once you see it, you could eradicate it from your being. You could get rid of it. But until it's made known to you, like, you will suffer it, or it'll keep coming up in your life and causing stumbling blocks in your life. So that's kind of like the gist of what he was saying about Yakub, but he did refer to him as a rebel. That's the key part that I wanted us to notice right there. Now, like I said, you watch part 1, there was a scientist, right, that he made the tribe of Shabazz in terms of, how can I say it? He made the tribe of Shabazz that populated the continent of Africa and the jungles there, right? The Shabazz as a tribe already existed, but this particular scientist, the messenger doesn't actually give him a name. He just often refers to him as dissatisfied scientist. And he says he took his family or his people from Mecca. They left Mecca and went down into the jungles of Africa, right? And then he began to live a certain lifestyle that presented or created a culture amongst us that exists to this very day. So he's the father of, we would say, the people that populate the continent of Africa, and us as his descendants here in North America. We are his descendants, so he is our father. So one of the similarities, right, is both Yakub was dissatisfied. It says that Yakub was born amongst a population during that time on the earth, and the messenger said that 70% of the people on earth at that time were satisfied with life itself, but 30% of our people were dissatisfied. Yakub was born amongst that population that was dissatisfied. So this was no races then. It was just only black people on earth. No different races of different sorts. Just black people. But he was born out of that dissatisfied. So the messenger also refers to the scientist, and just for lack of a better word, we'll just refer to him as Shabazz, just so we could keep it clear of who we speaking on. We just name him Shabazz, but he's actually a member of the tribe of Shabazz. But both of them are dissatisfied. That's one detail that they share, right? Another detail that they share is both desire to make a new people, right? A new people that didn't exist prior to. So of course we said Yakub was the maker of the devil, So he made a people that their nature would lean more towards the negative side of self, or the weaker side, I should say, the weaker side of self, to where they give in to their passions and desires and different how could I say, pathologies, I should say. They so they lean towards that, and based off of that nature, they will create a particular culture on earth that will grow and grow as they spread across the earth. So that was Yakub's side of things. Shabazz, he wanted to make a people that would be strong, right? That could endure the jungles and that could conquer the wild beasts there in the jungles of Africa. He wanted to make us tougher, harder people. And so that's what he did. He migrated from Mecca to the jungle and began to live what we refer to as jungle life. And it made us a much tougher people. Like I said, we went over that in part 1, so you can refer back to that on this channel. If you hit videos, like all the videos that I did on this channel will come up and you'll be able to click on it. But they both made two people, right? Another detail that they share is, right, both were advised against their determined idea, right? So this one is interesting right here, right? How could I say it? The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that there was a council of God. Sometimes it's referred to that in the Bible. You hear that, the council of God. Sometimes it's referred to as the 24 elders in the book of Revelations. Sometimes you may refer to them as Elohim, right? Which is like a plurality of gods or men with high wisdom and high power. And they like a secret council. In the Holy Quran, they are called the Exalted Assembly. Exalted Assembly. So, according to the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, this assembly, they advised against Shabazz taking his family and creating, making this new people in the Holy Land, right? In the region of Mecca, right? In that particular vicinity. He wanted to make his people there, but the Council of God, the 24 elders, the 24 scientists advised against it. They said no, they didn't agree that he could make his type of people that he wanted to make there in the Holy Land. So he was exiled basically, and that's when he went down into the jungles of Africa to do his experiment and make a new people that was closer to nature, right? And they would be strong and indestructible, these people. That was his goal, that was his aim. So the council said he couldn't do it there. He had to go elsewhere. So, they advised him against it. So the same goes for Yaqub. Yaqub came about much later. Like I said, with Shabazz, this happened 50,000 years ago. Yaqub's history took place 6,000 years ago. So Yaqub was also advised by this particular council. And he was told that he couldn't make his man in the Holy Land. So he was exiled to an island out in the Aegean Sea. But the interesting part about Yaqub is it was God in person that that advised him against it and that exiled him, that told him he couldn't do it in the Holy Land, right? So the interesting part of that is the language the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad uses in Message to the Black Man. He just refers to this person as a king because Yaqub began spreading his teachings in the vicinity of Mecca. And he began to cause a stir in the people. He started getting all of these converts and people that was attached to his idea. Again, remember he was amongst the 30% dissatisfied. So he probably attracted those that was dissatisfied with life on the planet at that time for whatever reason, one reason or another. Who knows? All the reasons in general. So he began attracting these people when they was on the streets, and they began to cause like a ruckus, teaching these wild teachings, as they were saying, like, they're going to make slaves of men, like people were going to do their work for them. There was no such thing on the planet at that time, like people doing your work for you, so they caused a stir, and they began to get locked up and jailed, him and his followers, so much so that all the jails were filled with Yakub and his followers. So the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said that a king, he got word of this man causing the stir. It says Yakub went under an alias, right? It didn't give his alias, but it just said he used the alias when he got locked up, like many of us do. You get in trouble with the law. Sometimes people give a fake name. So that's what Yakub did. So the king asked, well, what did he do? Tell me about his activities. So they told him what he was doing. And the king said, that's not the name of this man. He knew his name. He knew that it was Yakub, because he read about him. He read about him in the history that is written ahead of time. The council of, that I mentioned earlier, the Council of God, or the 24 elders, they have a writing that is basically, the history of our nation or of our planet ahead of time. So that's why when you read scripture, Bible and Quran, it speaks of prophecies to come in the future. And it's very, very accurate in terms of what it writes, because they're looking into the future. They know the mathematical formula of how to see into the future. So the king read about him. So he was aware. He said, now I know who he is. So the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in his other writings, he basically identified that king as Allah. And it makes sense because the other people or authorities that had Yaqub confined, they didn't know who he was. Like I said, 24 scientists or elders, they have access to this holy writing of scripture, right? The books that we get as known as Bible and Quran is like a portion of a larger writing. It's basically a smaller part of it. It's a scripture. So they have access to it, but they don't have full access like Allah or the Supreme Being does. Whoever's the head of that council, that holy righteous council, he has full access to the book. So the others in authority didn't know who Yaqub was, but the king did. So that tells us that he was the best knower, that he was the head of the council, because he must have he knew exactly who Yaqub was. So in another writing, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad said that if I'm quoting it right, I'll put the quote up, but he said something to the fact that he's the first one since the death of Yaqub to be commissioned by God directly, right? So that's an interesting quote, that he's the first one since the death of Yaqub to be commissioned by God directly. So again, remember, it was the king that commissioned Yaqub, because he granted Yaqub the tools that he needed necessary to be successful. So when he went to him in the jail, that's what Yaqub said to him. Listen, you're causing a lot of trouble here in this area. Um, if I could take my people up out of here, we'd go somewhere else where we isolated and I could do my work, what I was born to do. So the king granted him that. He said, you know what, we will. And he put Yakub and his followers in boats, and sent them, to an island near GNC. In the Bible, that island is called Patmos. Sometimes we call it Pelon. So he sent them out there, but basically the king gave him permission and commissioned him to do it. Because, man, he could have stopped him and just, let him, rot in jail or execute him or whatever the case may be. But the king, who is Allah, saw a fit. He saw some good out of what Yakub was about to do, even though he was about to make the devil and make a people that would lean towards the wickedness or the weaker side of themselves. So that's what makes this interesting in terms of it, because they both got permission. They both got permission from the Lord of the worlds, right? From God in person. They just couldn't do it in the Holy Land, but they got permission. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, how could he be a rebel if God gave them permission? He granted them permission. Well, when we say rebel, it depends on how we relate to words, because one word can have many definitions. So when we say rebel, we don't mean like he started an armed resistance against God or what have you. Rebel sometimes just means when you go against the norm, like was normal behavior, activity, you go against that norm. And that's what we see in the history of Shabazz and Yakub, right? That they strayed away. You see, so that's what the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad used when it comes to Shabazz. So let me see. So they both had a determined idea, right? Shabazz and Yakub, and they both was advised against it. And that's why they had to leave and go to that other island. So they was exiled from the Holy Land, right? So they both strayed from God's way, right? But it ended up good. So when you look at the history of Shabazz, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad tells us that they strayed away from civilization. He said these are the ones that strayed away from civilization and are living a jungle life, right? So when we look at that language, strayed away from civilization, like means they drifted. They went away from a civilized way of life, just civilization. So civilization is really God's way. It's really God's way. It's knowledge, wisdom, understanding, culture, refinement, and that's basically dealing with civilization. Like I said in part one, dealing with technology and different things. We touched upon that. Like I said, we referenced back to part one to get a clearer definition. But they strayed away from God's way, and God's way is to be civilized, not savage. Of course, you wouldn't, label God as a savage. And that's what happened when Shabazz took his family down into these jungles, is that we fell into some savage behavior and we began to formulate ourselves into tribes. We begin to formulate ourselves into tribes, and when we raise tribe above civilization, it's like a division begins to happen. You become so divided that you can't unite on a principle that will bring you together and cause you to rise as a civilization, because you too vested in your differences. You raise the differences above all else. And that causes chaos, that causes confusion, it causes us to bicker and fight. And then we see how, a minority or a small group, of Europeans could come amongst us in Africa and divide us. Even though we was the majority on the continent, like a very small, population of people was able to conquer us by the millions, and that's because we strayed away from God's way on certain instances, right? So Yaqub, of course, he strayed away from God's way by performing a methodology that brought about a culture of wickedness. He brought forth a culture of wickedness, and that's straying away. But the interesting part of this to me is that even though the path that they took was on a negative course, in the end, it was for good. And, we could say that because everything that exists for a purpose. So, even our common sense tells us that if the devil exists, he could only be made by God. He could only have been, made by God because God is the only creator. So that means even evil has a purpose that will all tie into good in the end. You may go for a rocky road in the meantime, in between time, but eventually it leads to a road of salvation. So that's the case that we see in terms with Shabazz history as well as Yakub, even though that's maybe hard to see. So the Holy Quran says something, right, in the 70th Surah, Ayat 4. It reads, by which the angels and spirit ascend to him in one day, the duration of which is 50,000 years. Right? I'm going to read that one time. By which the angels and spirit ascend to him in one day, the duration of which is 50,000 years. I always thought that was an interesting ayat in the Holy Quran. And to me, that's saying that us, matter of fact, to me, that's saying it's speaking about Shabazz and him straying away from our way of life, from God's original way of life, which is righteousness, right? So to me, it's saying in this day, like, we will ascend back to Allah. Once Allah comes in and raises up his messenger with the truth and puts it into our ears, like, we will begin to ascend, meaning we climb up. We come up out of the mud and the muck and mire of civilization, and we begin to ascend and get closer and closer to God with this divine truth that we have, and we see that. We see that clearly when we look at those that rise out of the Nation of Islam into the world. Like, we rise like cream, like the cream of the earth, cream of the planet, So it's saying we ascend, and it says the duration of which 50,000 years, because that's the time span that we started to drift away from God. So the reason why I believe that too is because in Message to the Black Man, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, he basically wrote that he says that we haven't had our day in 50,000 years. That's the exact. He said, we, talking about the black man and woman here in North America and in Africa, he said we haven't had our day in 50,000 years. He said that's when we had our complete fall. But then he corrected himself. He said, I shouldn't say fall. He said, because we only allow the weaker of ourselves to rule. Right? So when he says that, the weaker of ourselves to rule, he's talking about, the race of devils, that's ruling the planet now under white supremacy, which is some people get freaked out when you say devil and God when you use these terms, because they may be thinking of some, evil person underneath the ground with a pitchfork and, flames rising up in the tail and, all of this different mythology that we get from movies and cartoons and in the way we understand scripture. Because scripture is very graphic, but a lot of scripture is symbolic, has symbolic meaning. So sometimes we get lost in the symbolism and we begin to think that it's not talking about human beings. But really, when we say the wicked, the devils, we just saying, we speaking of a system, really, of rule, right? A governing body, a governing system. Like, so we saying, when you look at history, the world right now is being ran or governed under a system called white supremacy, where whites are under the delusion that they are better just simply because they're white than all other people of color. And because they think they better, it makes it easier for them to suppress you, suppress us, to oppress us, and, just mistreat us, because they're under the delusion that they're better and they can do this and that they're within their right to do it. You see, and it's like a pathology. So when we say, devil, we're referring to that, really, that they just misusing their power. You know what I mean? And that's what caused them to put us into slavery. That's what caused them to annihilate the Native Americans here in America. They also did the same thing in India with the East Indians. They did it in Australia with the Aborigines. They do it amongst themselves with the Jews and the annihilation of the Holocaust and all of these different things. Because yes, they are abusive to one another too. Which makes sense. I used to often say, if it was a such thing as hell underneath the ground and it was all kind of spiritual demons down there, like, we wouldn't expect them to be treating each other good and everybody else bad. Like, if their evil is in their nature, they're gonna mistreat one another too. So that's why you have a lot of wars that broke out in Europe. All these different countries, a lot of wars took place. But anyway, I digress. I just wanted to point it out that even though, that they took a negative route, meaning Shabazz and Yakub, that in the end, it will turn out in God's favor and peace will be established on earth. So both of them share that same history right there. And like I said, the messenger said, not me, that it wasn't a fall, but we just allowed the weaker of ourselves to rule, because it's an experiment. It's an experiment because the negative, how can I say, the negative mindset that the devils display came up out of us. They didn't come out of thin air. They came out of the genetic makeup of the original people, which is the black people of the earth. So we have to, how could I say it, take account. We have to take an account for that the wickedness that they spread didn't come out of thin air, but it actually came out of our own being. You see? So that's why, the messenger, if you recall the first paragraph I read, said it wasn't a useless thing, and that Yakub did that because it was something hidden in the God, which means he means the original people. There was something hidden in us that had to be exposed so that we could deal with it, right? We could look at it and notice that it's a problem and then overcome it and rid ourselves of it for good, but that's a whole nother subject for another day. So one of the last things I wanted to show, we about to wrap it up. I wanted to say that, as I didn't mention this on the part one, so I wanted to mention it now. It's talking about the borders of nations. They change periodically because some people give flack about these teachings, right? You know, you never heard nobody expound on someone named Shabazz. You like, man, what is this Shabazz and Yaqub? Like, these are all myths. Like, you can't find this nowhere else but in the Nation of Islam. So people say they can't find like archaeological records of it from other civilizations, ancient civilizations. But I wanted to speak to that, and we wanted to talk about, you know, the nature of history. And I had a discussion on YouTube. YouTube, it was a brother from community of the Nation Gods and Herbs, and he flat out said that these teachings was lies, like the lessons itself was lies, that the root of civilization is in Mecca. Because he said Mecca was not an ancient city according to recent history. You know, when I say recent history, like the last 6,000 years, you know, we don't find records of Mecca stretching that far back. It's fairly a newer city, he was saying. That was his point. That when you look at the history of the different places that surrounded, that may have talked about that area, that it wasn't developed as a city. So that was his standpoint, that it was fake. But what I wanted to share was um, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad tell us that the borders and stuff of different nations change all the time. So we know that to be true because we're here in North America right now. And at one point, like we go back 300 years ago, this was a totally different place. Everyone spoke, you know, a different language. You know, they spoke the native dialects of the different tribes. You know, the politically correct, they call them Native Americans now, or West Indians, or Indians, however you want to say it. A different language was spoken here on this landmass, this region, right? And the borders were different in terms of the areas. You know, the borders were different from state to state, or tribal land, or tribal regions, and also touching Mexico, like, and all of these were just different pathways and different civilizations. So you don't really find the records and stuff of their civilization, you know, like even, how can I say, even when you look at the pictographs on the pyramids, like, it's not all known to us. Like, some of it we can't decipher, you know. We really don't know exactly what we're looking at. We may have discovered a lot of it, but some of it is foreign to us. So, and that's coming from the tribes that kept good records. But think about how many other hundreds and hundreds and thousands of tribes that you don't find no record of their existence, because maybe they had oral tradition. You see what I'm saying? They didn't write everything down on paper or carve it into stone. It's an oral tradition. So many places on earth have oral traditions. And it's not writing. Like, not everybody in the world could write. You know, that's a more recent thing of history. Like, when they made the printing press in, what's that, the 1400s, 1492 or something to that effect. The printing press went in effect, and they started printing Bibles. Like, even when they did that, most of the world couldn't read at the time. At least there in Europe, people couldn't read. So everything is an oral tradition. So the same thing applies in Mecca. Like, you don't find this because, for one, like I said, most of these things was an oral tradition. Secondly, is that the borders are always changing according to who takes power. You see what I'm saying? Who takes power, and civilizations rise and then they fall. They rise and then they fall. So that's why you don't see the record of it as a city. But the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad was telling us that that place is sacred, that we chose for ourselves. But, you know, he allows it to rise and fall. You know, so I just wanted to put that on our minds, something to think about, to say, you know, it's not necessarily that it's a fake story, or the city of Mecca is some made up place, just because you couldn't find the records dating past a certain time period. Because a lot of times we find our histories buried underneath the earth, whether it's buried underwater, buried under forests, buried under sands. And we see this as most ancient ruins are like that. They usually find them covered up by the forest or the sands or underwater. And just the term itself, ancient ruins, really convey that. So I just wanted to point that out. And lastly, the reason why we refer to Shabazz, as we see that the messenger straight out called Yaqub a rebel, but he was kind of ginger when it comes to Shabazz, right? In terms of his writing, he didn't outright refer to him as a rebel. He just said things like strayed away from civilization. But there was a conversation that the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad had with the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, where he spoke on it. He spoke on it because Minister Farrakhan wrote him a letter. He was upset with God for not sending us no divine guides in 50,000 years. He kind of just let us roam around Africa without a guide. And, there were civilizations that rose and fell in Africa too. Great civilizations, great empires, but some of them were very primitive. And like I said, they had a lot of bickering, a lot of bickering amongst each other and warlike, and they wasn't advancing. A lot of superstition and things of that nature. So the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan was upset with the guy for not sending us no one. So he wrote a letter to the messenger, and the messenger read it. And when he saw him in person, he told him, he says, that Shabazz rebelled against God, against that council. And he left on his own. Like, the God didn't send him out. The God didn't, actually exile him in that way. He just told him, you can't do it here. You know what I mean? So Shabazz, they advised against it, but Shabazz was determined. So he left and did it in another area, So, like I said, even though he took a negative course, it would lead to salvation. So this is not a program to say Shabazz was like some evil person, or some rebel that was on a war path against God. No, that's not what we're saying. He just went against the norm. But because he went against the norm, it had consequences, and the consequences is like what I spoke about earlier, the shape that we were in Africa, and the ebb and flow, rise and fall of the civilizations. So he said he rebelled because the council advised him against it. He was like, I'm going to do it anyway. So it did have good consequences too, because he did make us closer to nature, and he did make us indestructible, as a people. It means like we survived slavery due to the keen insight that Shabazz had. But when we say rebel, we just saying he went against the norm, and we had to pay a price for us becoming indestructible. Right? We paid a price, and that was us being lost for the 50,000 years. So when the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan talks about Shabazz, he's talking about that still being in our nature as a people here in America, because we're constantly rebelling, and we now that God has raised us up a messenger in our midst, and he tells us this is the best way to go. If we take these steps, we'll be guided aright, and life won't be so hard. Life won't be so difficult. We won't get so beat up by life if we take these steps. But we have that character of Shabazz still in us, and we rebel, and we want to do things our way. You see, we don't want to listen to the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan and the path that he's laying before us in the footsteps of the messenger. we say, nah, we know a better way, you know, and we carve out this route and carve out that route, you know, and it's like we determine, you know, to do our own thing. And, you know, when we do that, it leads, you know, to hardship. Sometimes it leads to death itself, you know, and generational curses, you know. So that's kind of what the messenger was saying to the ministers, that he rebelled, so God wasn't under no obligation to go get him in those 50,000 years, like, because he went out on his own, you know. So he wasn't obligated to go after him. You know, God just did it out of his mercy, because he's a merciful God, and it was time. Like, we wandered long enough, you know, and he came amongst us, you know, the descendants of Shabazz, and gave us divine guide in the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And, you know, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan is an extension of that mercy amongst us now, in the absence of the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So that was basically it, is that he led a contrary life because he went against the norm of how God was governing themselves there in civilization. You know, he went away from civilization into the bush, and, you know, they begin to take on all kind of superstitions and, you know, mutilate ourselves and different things. Like I said, we touched on that in part 1, so you could go back and witness that, you know. So that was the thing, though. But God gave them permission, but they just did their own thing. I don't drag this out. I wanted to get this under 30 minutes, but I went over a little bit. But let me know what you think about this in the comments. And like I said, hit that like button, hit the subscription button, subscribe to the channel. I want to get it up, as I want to rename the channel to make it easy to be found on YouTube, social media. So hit that like button and share. And in the comments, let me know what you think, and we could discuss it. You know, if I missed the mark on some points or something like that, you want to correct me, or you want to ask me some questions or what have you, just hit the comment section. All right, thank you for listening. All right, I greet you in the words of peace and paradise. Assalamu alaikum. May Allah bless us all with the light of understanding.